Good morning. My name is Neema. I'm a chapter membership manager of Oikos. Today we are interviewing Jonas. Jonas, please, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Happy to meet you, Neema, and really nice to connect to you here virtually. My name is Jonas Hartle. I'm working for the UN Institute for Training and Research. We are one of the main training arms of the UN. We are based in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm in the office of the executive director as his special assistant. I used to work already for a longer time for the UN, and in my previous role I was based in New York, and I ran an initiative engaging business schools in integrating sustainability and responsible leadership in the curriculum of business schools across the globe. On a personal level, I'm from Germany, and I've been married now for a number of years to my wife, who is Brazilian. And we've just had a daughter last year here in Switzerland, who is now has a dual nationality, German and Brazilian, while living here in Switzerland. So one of the key values I'm also much upholding and trying to bring, of course, close to my daughter and our family is, living together with many people from different nationalities can be a challenge, but it's always enriching. So this is me on my personal level as well.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Please, can you tell us more? How do you integrate sustainability at universities?
Sure. I wanted to tell you a story, Neema, about my experience in 2011 and 2012. When I helped to bring universities to one big UN conference, the conference Rio Plus 20, which was 20 years after the original Earth Summit. This meeting took place in 2012 in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. It was meant to set the world back on the right track when it comes to sustainable development. And actually, the story relates also very much to today's time, because currently many of us are living very restricted lives due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it reminds me that these gloom and doom scenarios that we see so much currently on the news remind me a little bit about the time in 2011, but it also, and that's what I want to talk to you about, helps us to realize that with the right level of energy and the right vision, we can bring and activate a number of people to help them feel empowered and bring us hopefully also back on the right track. So let me go back to 2011, because this was a time when there were already some of the crises that we are currently still dealing with, a criticism of globalization, strong, sense that climate change was going in the wrong direction and we wouldn't do enough. Social disparities, these were all already with us in 2011. And at the same time, there was a big UN conference on the horizon, Rio Plus 20. I remember I used to work at the UN Secretariat at that time. And the question really was, at the end of 2011, how do we motivate, on the one hand, governments, the main stakeholders still of the UN, but on the other hand, a number of other stakeholders, individuals and citizens from all around the world, in activating them to come charging to Rio, really physically, but also virtually, and bringing many creative ideas and many creative solutions to help us overcome some of the systemic challenges that are at the root of the Sustainable Development Challenge. And one of the brilliant things that I thought was happening was that instead of making this a very usual international conference where you have a lot of heads of states and heads of governments talk to each other, we wanted from the very beginning to make sure that we had the clear roadmap to bring in as many voices, thousands, if not millions of voices from individual citizens from around the world. So one of the things we did, and that was a change that came from one day to the other, was to give a very visionary slogan to the conference. And by that, trying to motivate the input from many people. So the slogan that was chosen was Rio Plus 20, the world we want. And this question of the world we want, of course, opened a number of questions, because how do you define the world we want? And that question was given to many people. Again, not just governments, but individuals. And we asked through online means, through face-to-face meetings across the world with the help of many of the UN offices, and many stakeholders were involved, that question a number of times. And the outcome was, I mean, a very rich puzzle of answers. There's not one clear roadmap, of course, but that was the building ground for the decision that was taken in Rio de Janeiro then in mid of 2012 at that conference to create a follow-up to what was by then the Millennium Development Goals. So the outcome from Rio Plus 20 was to create something that's still with us, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a set of 17 goals which are in effect since 2015, so 3 years after 2012, and guide us as the world to 2030. And what's in the Sustainable Development Goals? It is basically the definition to that question, the world we want. So let me just give you one example. We have said that much of the progress that could be seen in the Millennium Development Goals was around poverty reduction. And so with the Millennium Development Goals, there was actually a huge success by halving poverty, so reducing it by 50% between the time period of 2000 to 2015. The world reached that already by 2010. So in the current framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a goal to eradicate poverty by 2030. So I think this is a very visionary and very strong statement that governments and many stakeholders agreed on then in 2015. The other goals relate to climate change and other environmental topics, but we have also some other social issues like gender equality, the right to quality education, and of course also some of the economic topics. Circular economy is one of the themes that is cross-cutting and also directly addressed in one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So how does it relate to universities? And that was also your question. Back in 2011, my role was to bring in business schools to the conference Rio Plus 20, and we could really see a lot of enthusiasm among business school stakeholders that we invited. We had a 2-day conference around the themes of responsible leadership. The initiative is called Principles for Responsible Management Education. And out of that came a lot of enthusiasm for bringing this outcome of Rio Plus 20 to business schools. And currently in 2020, we can see the results. Many business schools and many universities have actually actively embraced the Sustainable Development Goals as a vision for new courses and embedding into existing courses the ideas around the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So I think this is a pretty nice success story. And of course, there are many challenges that came with it, but I'm happy to talk about this more in detail. But this was the basic story I wanted to share with you around that big conference, Rio Plus 20, the outcomes and how that related to, and how that relates actually to higher education and specifically also business schools.
Thank you so much. How do you manage the conflicts of interest with different stakeholders? And do you think that stakeholder involvement would help to solve sustainability challenges?
That's a good question. So let me come to that example of how do you bring universities to change the way they structure and embed universal kind of values like sustainability into an existing curriculum. And with that, group of universities that I was in contact with at that time, it was clear that they were not a homogeneous group. And within universities, you have lots of different stakeholders that have an influence, be it the faculty, the administration, of course, students, but also the parents of students, businesses, civil society organizations, and governments. And then there are a number of very kind of critical stakeholders also that govern the way universities and business schools are run. For example, accreditation units, accreditation organizations. So the challenge was, how do we bring and align those different stakeholders and their interests in driving the change we wanted to see, i.e. embracing the Sustainable Development Goals as a guiding framework. So one of the challenges was really to first of all, bring them together, these different stakeholders in a coherent way. one of the solutions was the convening power of this neutral body, the UN. Many individuals wanted to come to the table, a physical table or physical tables that we began to develop over the years. And so whenever we had the UN that I work for call for such a meeting, it was actually quite easy to bring the different stakeholders who might not have met in the first place to the same room, to the same discussion. But then, of course, the interest, I mean, sometimes had to, I mean, the aligning interests was something that had to be worked on. While nobody rejected the idea that sustainable development and responsible leadership should be embedded, the question was always, or the nitty-gritty and the challenges laid always in the actual details, and that required a number of innovative ways. We had, for example, international working groups where we came up with some pilots that could be shown as leading the way, and that encouraged then other universities and business schools to come along. We could also show that it is in the best interest of a university to stay ahead of the curve and answer the demand, whether it was already very loud or not, from future generations of students. And I would say now in hindsight, this call for sustainable development, for example, and or also the questions around sustainable development and climate change, certainly currently in 2020, we see that the current generation of students are much more aware of those topics and want to see that also being taught. So universities and business schools who back in 2012 were already jumping on that wagon and beginning to adapt to that new scenario can now rightfully be seen as leaders and attract more students to them because they can show that they have actually made the changes that are being called for. So hence, yes, there were challenges along the way, but by managing, to also show that in the end the result is beneficial for institutions like higher education, we could solve some of those conflict of interest, or these kind of how to align those different interests from stakeholders.
Yeah, great. How do you build trust to different stakeholders, and how do you help them to be motivated in corporate social responsibilities in their daily activities or what you're doing, going green and so on?
Mm-hmm. So I think, again, looking at some of the experience I had was you have to create, a framework in which the different parties feel safe to exchange ideas, which can at times sound a little bit crazy because they go beyond what each individual or each individual organization that they work for would agree to, be it changes in accreditation, be it changes in a specific course, be it changes across an institution. So you first have to create that safe space. And again, there having a neutral convener can be quite helpful. And again, I've now been working for a number of years with the UN. I think it lends itself very beautifully to such being a neutral convener. Secondly, you have to have a roadmap with some type of vision going forward. And here the sustainable development goals are really a beautiful set of goals, because when you look at that, nobody would disagree that we want to reach a world in which poverty is eradicated. Nobody wants to disagree with a planet that is livable. But how to get there, of course, is in the question. And so oftentimes what we did was to have, after bringing people into that safe zone where they felt comfortable to share with each other, we set then oftentimes a very clear roadmap and saying at the end of that process, we would have to have some type of agreement that we could announce, for example, at an international conference. Because by guiding people towards like this clear outcome and presenting something to the wider public, you bind them to work diligently together and not just like let time pass and people think that you can then just get out of it by never coming to an agreement. So having a clear roadmap and having also a goal to where to go to and where to make a bigger announcement, a bigger engagement public was always very helpful. So these types of agreement, having a neutral convener, a roadmap with clear steps that had to be agreed not in the very first beginning, but throughout the first phase of the process, and making people feel safe to share, but also working towards a common agenda slash vision. These are some of the ingredients which I felt were quite helpful in motivating people to embrace the types of changes we were calling for.
um, Merging innovation and sustainability. Do you think that every university should implement it in the curriculum if it's very important, or it should be a choice?
I think it's a must. There is no question around that. I think, I mean, because you're asking in general about innovation, no university can stand still because knowledge is always developing. And as a university that is meant to develop and of course also be custodian of knowledge, it's their bread and butter to continue to innovate and to develop. Now, the question is, what type of innovation are we talking about? So when we talk about sustainable development, I would say that at the principle level and at the values level, many people can agree to that. However, when it comes to the specific way of implementing that, that's where you have disagreement. But in principle, I think nobody would actually disagree that these are important topics, and that otherwise, I mean, the mission of a university would be failed, but secondly, also we would, or institutions of higher learning would fail the world and the students and the researchers and the stakeholders that they engage with.
Great. Tell us a story when you've been at university. What did you do to help other students to learn about sustainability? Did you have some activities, social clubs, association that you're leading? What was your path and your journey?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was a student myself in university, I always engaged in extracurricular activities. And it sounds a little bit interesting, right? Because you talk, I mean, we called them, or they were called extracurricular, but they were, in my sense, very much part of my learning journey. So even before university, I used to, I mean, run for the student parliament in our high school. And then again, I was on the team representing our students vis-a-vis faculty in my undergrad studies. And then when I was studying abroad, I was also taking some activities that were offered across the campus. But I think nowadays or today, I've been much clearer that many of those activities were very helpful in forming who I am and also what I wanted to work on following my studies. So, I mean, one example is actually predating my engagement in university. Between high school that I finished in Germany and then going for my undergrad university degree, I took a year off, which actually was mandated because at that time you had this mandatory civil service requirement in Germany. But I chose that in a place, I mean, far away from Germany, in Mexico, and spent a longer time than was required, so 1.5 years almost. Learned Spanish and learned, to navigate, I mean, in a completely new culture for me in Latin America. But that was so eye-opening to me because I used to work at that time in an in an NGO that worked with people of lower income. And we offered health classes, we offered other types of training, and I did all types of work. But this was so enriching because it taught me, I mean, humility, but also opened my eyes to the richness of, the world. And I came back very enriched and, definitely interested in trying to make a difference in the world. So when I then began to study, I wanted to continue looking for opportunities that brought me outside the context in which I was living. I mean, that was Germany at that time. So very quickly I found ways then to go abroad again. And hence, I mean, my trajectory, throughout my last 20 years have always been, bridging and trying to connect people from different cultures and from different backgrounds.
Yeah, great. What are the challenges that you encountered during your university journey? like running a student club or an association? And what did you do to overcome all of these challenges? And what did you learn from those challenges?
So, I mean, a student club, I can't really tell you right now because I didn't run one or I didn't participate in one. So I wouldn't be able right now to speak to that directly. I can tell you then in my previous role looking at universities and working with universities, I engaged with a number of them. And I mean, there it was often, I mean, what I saw, what students told me, one of the main challenges was time, you know, I mean, how much time to dedicate to different causes, while of course they also had to finish their classes and I mean, the requirements. But in my sense, I mean, that of course it can be a challenge. I mean, at least what I heard from students, but oftentimes when they, you know, did something in those student clubs that really was speaking to what they wanted to engage in, they found always, you know, the extra time at night or over time periods when they could focus also on their studies. So I didn't see this as a detriment, but I always encourage students to engage around that.
Talking about recognize your own value, does it help you to develop your professional career or the objective or plan that you have?
So, I mean, one of the values that is very important to me is supporting other people. You know, that's, I mean, I think for me, this really gives me joy and really fulfillment. And I mean, I also, I mean, have to say that, I mean, throughout the last years, I learned to be able to set some boundaries because it can be quite exhausting. And one advice I would certainly want to give is when you are of that type of, I mean, personality, you can, of course, also overexhaust yourself. So it's important to stay centered and also sometimes nurture yourself and your own needs in order to be continuously in service of other people. Otherwise, you break down. But I mean, physically and mentally, of course. So that's an important, I mean, advice I can give you. But so this idea around helping other people has always empowered me and has always kind of powered me in my passion for what I do. And very concretely, I mean, I've seen, you know, I mean, it's sometimes not immediately, but you see a very positive feedback when you go out and help individuals in all types of organization and in all types of positions with advice, with, I mean, support through projects that we worked on. The positive feedback that you get is, of course, I mean, a very big one. But so one of the key values that I, you know, I mean, strive for is helping other people in whatever they are good at or in whatever they are struggling with to help them, yeah, move forward.
Yeah, when you tell us about supporting other people, do you think that teamwork is very important at work, at university, in a community? And why is it important? Why people should team up?
I think it's key. I mean, I can tell you very practically, in any organization that a current student will enter, teamwork is going to be the main way of achieving anything. Main reason is that we are currently living in such a complex world where nobody has the knowledge and the capability to do everything that is needed. So you need to work together in teams, small, big, inside an organization or physically across borders sometimes. So that's a key, I mean, not just here at the UN level, but in any organization. So, you know, enabling individuals to do that is, I think, a key ingredient for success for the future.
And I have another question about UN. How do you manage to measure progress in sustainability development? What do you use? Is it data? Is it community involvement? How do you measure?
Yeah, so when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I mentioned before, there's a clear way how to measure that. It's not very easy to see it, but it's there because inbuilt in that process of 15 years since 2015 to 2030 are annual updates from member states, from countries. So each year in June or July, this year this meeting was virtual, but it used to be in person in New York. Governments and stakeholders, and I come back to that point, will come together to present so-called voluntary national reviews, VNRs, and that's the status of the given country in achieving and also showing the gaps across or against all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the process how to develop a VNR, a voluntary national review, is meant to involve all relevant stakeholders in a given country. So it's not just the offices of statistics or the ministries who will develop a nice looking report. The way how to get to reports is different, but it oftentimes involves many different meetings and many different stakeholders giving input in drafting and developing such a report. Every country will have 2 or 3 opportunities in this 15-year time span to present progress. And the idea is by presenting those progress reports, of course, not just to look at the positive implementation, but also to show some of the challenges. And by that point to certain areas that still where progress is still needed. So that's one way. Data, you looked at that or you asked for that, is definitely, I mean, measuring progress relies on reliable data. In some countries, we have very good data sources. In some others, we are still missing that. It's a big challenge. I mean, it's not all there. But if you look around this event that's called the High-Level Political Forum that takes place once a year, there are many reports that come out that will tell you the state of the world and of individual countries. So there is one very good report by the SDSN group, together with a German-based foundation. They highlight every year the status of sustainable development in all 193 member states. So that's one big effort coming together once a year to measure that type of progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. And to your question, how to measure the status of sustainable development.
Yeah, great. In my last question, I'd like to know your advice you can give for students who are listening now. What would be your advice in the responsible leadership?
So I have oftentimes heard from students that they want to work at the UN, and I completely understand that. When I speak to students, this seems to be like a really nice, I mean, a dream job, and I understand. I mean, I feel I'm in my dream job. Unfortunately, we have limited resources and not so many jobs to offer. So what I would advise a student is to, whichever organization you aim to work for, be it a company, be it a public entity, or be it even at the UN, you will always find those opportunities to make sustainable development happen in your organizational context. So, for example, if you enter the corporate world, you might not have that voice and standing very early on. But across all organizations and all companies that I've been seeing, many changes are happening right now, specifically embracing sustainable development as per the Sustainable Development Goals. So find your niche within the organization that you aim for, and then see how can you bring in new topics. And that will require also that you, I mean, topics around sustainable development. And that will also require that you work and motivate, you know, your team, the teams that you are in contact with, to help you move in that direction. There are many ways to do that. I think the best way is to stay humble. I mean, you will not enter an organization and change things from one day to the other, but work in a way that you continue building coalitions in the organization that you enter and across other organizations. And with that, you will see that there continues to be a groundswell of change possible by making, I mean, you know, by connecting to many like-minded people that can help you to drive forward the change you are envisioning. So my recommendation would be don't aim for a job necessarily at the UN, but maybe aim for a job that brings the Sustainable Development Goals into the organizations that you can work for, be it companies, be it civil society organizations, or be it your own enterprises that you might want to create.
Jonas, thank you so much for being part of our interview. I would like to ask a last question. I would say, what can you choose between individualism and collaboration?
Well, I think both is important. But I think, I mean, finding the right way between, the two and that middle ground is important for everybody to find. I mean, you won't achieve anything, as I mentioned before, without collaboration. But you, of course, also need to, know who you are. I think there is a very nice African proverb that sums that up. You might know that, Neema, and that's I think it's very true to that. And it goes like this. I mean, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that gives you the answer to your question.
Thank you so much for your answers. We are glad to learn from you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.